And we started Giants last week. Let me hand out. These are the same handouts as I had last week. So if you got one last week, you may already have it. If not, here they are. And I think I have enough for everyone. If they run out, some of you may have to learn how to share. The one we're not going to actually look at tonight, we looked at it last week, and that was the kind of web of the giants. We went through all the giants in the Bible, as far as I can tell. I think I got every single one in that web, and they're mostly connected to each other in different ways. We went through that last week, so I'm not going to do that again. And then we were looking at some lessons we can learn from the giants, and the first one was big faith, and we looked at Abraham and the 10 spies, and briefly looked at David, two of whom had faith to take on the giants, one of whom illustrated lack of faith to take on the giants. And then we talked about big will, which was kind of giants stand in the way of God's will. The fact that there were times when God had a certain plan for his people, and there were giants between God's people and God's will, and the giants don't stand a chance in that kind of a situation. God can take care of that. What I want to do tonight is to skip to the last one, which is called Big Preparation. I should mention, I'm using the word big as a naming device. So for the whole Monster series, it's Big Lessons from Monsters. This is Big Lessons from Big Men. And so tonight I want to start with Big Preparation. And I considered starting by singing the song Only a Boy Named David, although I couldn't lead it, but I figured somebody could, but I'm not going to do that, except to say, if you think about the song Only a Boy Named David, it's not the most biblical song that we sing. And I'm afraid that as a result, it does kind of give us the wrong lesson, tries to teach us the wrong lesson about David and Goliath. So Goliath, of course, is the most famous of the giants scripturally. That's usually, if you ask people for a giant from the Bible, Goliath is the one that everybody would probably know. And then there are a few others that, in fact, when I asked last week, there were several others that were familiar to those who have been around the church. But Goliath is by far the most famous. But so what lesson should we learn from David and Goliath? I'm going to come back to that at the end, but I want to start by looking at the story maybe a little differently than you typically do. And the first question I want to look at is, sorry, looks like my notes didn't update from one app to the other. Oh, well, we'll live with it. First thing I want to look at is his age and experience. And one of my most annoyed aspects of Only a Boy Named David is how tall we make David in that song. He's usually about 3 foot tall, barely ready for kindergarten. And I think we kind of take that as being accurate. We are in 1 Samuel 16. Well, actually, I'm going to start in 1 Samuel 16. Goliath is in 17. Because in 1 Samuel 16, we start to get a little bit of a hint about how old David was. Now, I'll just tell you, I did some research. One author I found said David was 21. Another one put him in his early to mid-20s, maybe more like 26. And so there are some differences of opinion because we're not told exactly. Tim Chafee and Floyd Jones wrote an article that I found that pointed to a number of verses that give us some hints. So 1 Samuel 16:18, if you remember, Saul's having mental problems. He's looking for a musician to calm him down. And he asks his servants to find someone. And in verse 18, then answered one of the servants and said, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. Now, this is a chapter before his encounter with Goliath, so assuming that 1 Samuel is chronological, this is before this. This is when he's going to go to play for King Saul before Goliath is on the scene. And he's described as a mighty, valiant man. And the word mighty is the word Gabor. We're going to come back to that later, hopefully. It means powerful. Warrior can actually mean tyrant. So it does mean he's strong. He's a powerful man. Valiant connects to valor, strength, force. So he's a mighty, valiant man. He's a powerful, strong man and a man of war, and war does mean war. I mean, it's not one of those cases where it's like, well, actually, it means battle, fighting, war. He's prudent, which means he has discernment. No, there's no age on discernment. He is comely, which means he's good looking, which again, there's no age limit on that. And he's cunning and he's cunning and playing. So the parts of it, his musical ability, his discretion, his attractiveness, the Lord being with him, don't really give us an age. But the mighty valiant man and a man of war does kind of put him out of the kindergarten category. And much more likely to put him into at least the teen category. And when we go to after this, immediately after that, it says, therefore Saul sent messengers unto Jesse and said, send me David thy son, which is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread and with a bottle of wine and a kid, and sent them by David his son unto Saul. And David came to Saul and stood before him. And he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. So Saul sends for David. David gets sent to play music for Saul, but he becomes David's armor bearer. One time I was listening to somebody talking about David and Goliath, and he made the comment, we don't know if David had ever even seen armor before. And the answer is yes, he had. He was carrying Saul's armor, which would put him in a junior position to Saul as the king, but nevertheless, he's around the military. He's got some military experience as a aide-de-camp kind of situation. Armor bearer, he's working with Saul. So he gives us some idea of his experience. He's probably a teenager, has some experience with the military, with the armor. And then we move to chapter 17, and familiar passage, one where we often get he was a little kid, I think, idea. It comes from chapter 17, verse 33. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. Now, you notice he doesn't comment on David's size, but on his inexperience. You're still young. Goliath has been a warrior since he was young. So Goliath is older. Of course, Saul's older. They're both looking at David as you're awfully young. How young is unclear. Late teens, early 20s would still be young depending on how old you are. But in the context of a career military man like Goliath, it would still be. So David is young, but not necessarily small. And we get another hint about his... we'll get to talk about his size in a minute. Another thing that we get from David at this time is some of his experience. David says to Saul, this is verses 34 and 35, and I'll be reading 36 and 37 also. David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. When he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. So David is telling, Saul's kind of questioning David's abilities as a youth. And David's like, hey, I've taken on a lion and I've taken on a bear. I think I can handle a giant. Okay, there's a little bit of faith there. But even so, what you see as a young man, well, number one, he can't be that young. I don't know any father who would send his 6-year-old out to take care of the sheep with the expectation he's going to be fighting off lions and bears. You would expect to send out someone at least old enough to survive. Most fathers are going to have that perspective. Now, I will also acknowledge, people mature differently in different cultures, but at any rate, he is old enough to take care of himself. He proved it when he killed the lion and the bear. And just the whole idea that he grabbed the lion by the beard and smote the lion and killed him, this is not a dude I want to meet in a dark alley. You're not getting the impression of some little inexperienced kid. The statement of a valiant man and a man of war, don't know that he'd ever been in battle other than with lions and bears, and that's still impressive. Yes. So David comes into this battle probably older than we usually think of him, and a lot more experienced than what we usually tell the story. And we mentioned the lion and the bear, but I'm not sure why. I don't remember at least that being emphasized, that this makes David a pretty fearsome character. Now, one of the arguments that David was younger was the fact that only 3 of his brothers are in the army. When you turn 20 was the age that you could go into the military. Only 3 of his brothers are in the military, so that leaves 4 or 5 brothers. There is a brother who seems to have died young, but there are 3 or 4 brothers in between. And so if that puts David at his mid-teens, 15, 16, unless his brothers aren't in the military for some other reason other than age. So if David's 18, he has a couple of brothers who aren't in the military, which you got out of military duty if you were just married, if you just built a new house, which is interesting. Anyway, there were some ways you could get out of getting in the military. So it's possible that some of his brothers weren't in the military for other reasons. But that would push David's age a little bit younger. So we're still talking, though, most likely a teenager. So if instead of only a boy named David, maybe we should sing only a teen named David. Now, this is a lot less solid ground scripturally, but how big was David? And the hint is in 1 Samuel 17, verses 38 and 39. Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass upon his head, and he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. Now, Saul was a big man. We actually talked about this last week, the fact that Saul's head and shoulders taller than everybody else in Israel, so David, as a typical Israelite, would probably, at full grown, you would expect to be smaller than King Saul. If he's as little as we put him in the song, he's much littler than King Saul. And you've probably seen pictures of David in Saul's armor, and it's like dragging on the ground because it's so big. Saul was insane, but he wasn't stupid. If David was really that small, Saul wouldn't offer him the armor that's not going to even come close to fitting him. Now, in reading through this, it's possible that the armor was more or less one size fits all. So it may not have been quite, David had to be Saul's size to wear it, but he certainly would have been adult size. If he's offering him adult armor, he would have been adult size. So he was probably full grown. But there is a little hint that Saul thought David could handle his armor, that David may have been a big boy, not, even more than normal size. He may have actually been a big boy. Which, just thinking about it, this is not my notes, but when Samuel saw Eliab, it sounds like he was impressed with Eliab's size, which was David's big brother. So it very well may be that the family was a good-sized family. That I'm obviously making some inferences here. But at any rate, David probably was a full-size teenager, fully grown at this point. Then we get to slings. I don't know if any of you have taken the time to study slings in the Bible and history. It is an amazing thing. The more I study, the more cool it is. Chapter 17, verses 40 and then 49. He took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, put them in his shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. And then jumping to 49. And David put his hand in his bag, took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. We don't read a lot about slingers in the Bible, but there is one other reference to slingers. I'm going to go ahead and ask. Where else do we see slingers referred to in Scripture?
Left-handed ones, right?
Judges, left-handed ones, yes. 700 left-handed slingers. Do you remember how good they were? They could hit a hair's breadth with the stone. That's the biblical data. We know that there was a tribe, the Benjamites had 700 men who could use a sling and they could hit a hair's breadth, which is fairly impressive. But slings are very common. Until I started studying a lot of this, I didn't know. We're used pretty much worldwide and for over 1,000 years, from the time of David all the way into the first century. Slings were used a lot. The Jews used them against the Moabites, the Assyrians against the Jews at Lachish, the soldiers from Rhodes in the Greek armies, the Balearic mercenaries in the Carthaginian armies, the Gauls against the Romans against the Britons. I ran across an article where they'd actually found the sling stones in Britain, at a fort in Britain, that were Roman sling stones. So they were used for 1,000 years in armies all over the Middle East, up into Europe. And you actually there are pictures of rows and rows of archers marching into battle on some of the reliefs. So it was a very common thing in ancient times. Slingers were eventually replaced by archers, but even when there were archers, there were still slingers. Even at the times when there were archers, there were still slingers. Now, we typically get our swing wrong, and I've actually did a little bit of more research on this and had to kind of adjust what I've said, because what I'd read in the one article was, number one, you don't do it round and round your head, it's vertical, and you don't go round and round, it's a single swing. But I found a video today, Balearic, which was one of the mercenaries I mentioned. There's such a thing as Balearic competition slinging today. And if you look, you can find videos of people doing it. And there is a round and round, but it is a vertical round and round. And then when they do the last sling, when you're at the last round, when you're actually going to launch it, does kind of go almost horizontal before you let it go. So it's done very differently than what I've always envisioned it. So it would have been vertical for the build up, and then it goes almost horizontal for the actual last strike. Now the stone, and we always say 5 little stones he took. The stones would vary from anywhere from about 2 ounces to 18 ounces. Wow. So 18 ounces is over a pound. So they say kind of use tennis ball size is what they kind of like the general designation is. Now, David took stones. Throughout history, they also use clay and lead to make the stone or the bullet. And this has nothing to do with David directly, but I found it hilarious. They were actually engraved. The clay and lead ones were actually engraved with words. Words like, take that, catch, ouch, this is yours, be lodged well, and pain. So insult to injury. And they also would drill holes in them so that they would buzz as they went through the air, just to add some fear to the coming of these things. Now again, David probably didn't drill any holes into the stones on his way to take out Goliath, but it is historically that's part of slinging. The range is up to 1,300 feet, but they say they were more effective at about 400 feet, which is still over a football field. The football field's about 300 feet, so it's further than a football field. And they could hit any, according to the historians and so forth, they could hit any part of the face they were aiming at, which is consistent with what the Bible says about the Benjamites. When you hear the Benjamites could hit a hair's breadth, you're like, that's like almost legendary. Is that accurate? Not that we don't trust the Bible, but, well, history would say, yeah, that's completely reasonable. Slingers were that good. They were considered the snipers of ancient warfare because, 400 to 1,300 feet, they're a long ways away, and with that kind of accuracy, they can easily take out someone. The speed of these, I'm going to come back to the aiming, but the speed. When I had read this previously, I'd found 60 to 70 miles per hour. This time when I was researching it, I was finding 100 miles per hour that these things are flying. So you're talking, say, a pound rock at 60 miles per hour meeting bone. And the one author said that they would damage organs, shatter bones, cause concussions, or kill those struck in the head. Seriously? And I'm thinking, yeah, I think that probably would work. And there was a National Geographic article, and the title was, Ancient Slingshot Was as Deadly as a .44 Magnum. And I don't have a National Geographic subscription, so I couldn't get to the whole article, but the one quote from the article literally said the stopping power of the slingshot stone was equal to that of a .44 Magnum bullet. Now, it was really hard to use a sling. You would train from the time they were children. They would train to become that good. It wasn't something you could just draft somebody in and say, here's a sling, now go do it. It was a real skill, which is why many of the ones in history were mercenaries. Certain areas were known for their slingers, and then they would be hired by armies because it was a specialized thing. Which means that for David to be a good slinger, he's been practicing for a very long time. He's not just picking this up. This is something, he's a shepherd, he's watching sheep. he's practicing his sling. It kind of makes sense, especially when it's a pretty effective weapon. A lion and a bear against a sling, you'd still have a good chance. A good slinger could do 7 shots per minute, which is a fairly good rate. And they would carry, and I just found this in one place, but I found they carried 3 slings. One of them wrapped around their head, one wrapped around their waist, and one in hand. And they actually had different length slings for different ranges that they were trying to reach. So slings were pretty impressive weapons. And that brings us to the lesson. What lesson are we supposed to learn from David and Goliath? And I feel like the lesson we usually try to teach is something along this line. The little boy with no ability or experience destroyed the great giant Goliath through God's miraculous intervention. But that's not the biblical story. That's completely misrepresenting the biblical account. David would have been a young man with probably a really significant skill in a very deadly art that God used because he was willing to be used. If you think about it, David probably wasn't the only slinger in the Israelite army. We know the Benjamites had 700 several years before this, but there were probably slingers in the Israelite army. King Saul was a big man, not as big as Goliath, but he was a big man. He was a man of war. They had other people who were qualified to take on Goliath, more qualified, and even giving the biggest we can do. David's a full-grown teenager who has been practicing his sling as a shepherd, so he's relatively competent, let's say, at just kind of going for minimum. He's not the most qualified person in the room necessarily, but he was the one who was willing. So I don't want to demean God's interaction. But Brother Grable gave us a quote many years ago that I really liked. When preparation meets providence, success is the result. And I think we need to be careful that we don't expect God to do all the work. It's our preparation, meeting God's timing and our willingness, and then we can have success. I'm a teacher, so I actually had on my wall of my classroom back in Salem, I had a David with his sling, and I said when David was practicing his sling, he didn't know about Goliath. When we're preparing, we don't know the battles we're going to face. We don't know the giants we're going to face. And it's very easy, okay, you all are past this stage, but it's very easy for teenagers to go, when am I ever going to use this? And it's like, I don't know. And you don't either. And even as adults, there are times when maybe we go through something or we get an opportunity to learn something and it's going to be tough and we're going to take time. And it's like, when will I ever use this? Well, you don't know when you're going to use it. And those of us a little older, we can look back and go, I never expected to be in this position doing this. I'm glad I'd learned that back then that I never had a clue I would need. I have a former student who we forced into taking Algebra 2 in high school. And years later, he contacts me. He's like, I'm going to become a math teacher. I'm so glad you made it. My mom and dad and you made me take Algebra 2. Like, I feel so good. I can tell all my students that now. But it's reality. God prepares us, and we don't know what the battle's going to be. And there are other lessons you can learn as well. But I'm running out of time, I'm noticing. And I do want to get to my last 2 points, even if I hit them very briefly. So anyway, David and Goliath, it's a big preparation. Prepare for the giants that God may put in your path, that you can bring glory to him through that battle. Okay, the weirdest of the giants are under the title Big Evil, the Nephilim and the Gibborim. And my question is, how evil can mankind be? And for this, we're going back to Genesis, chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. And here we meet the Nephilim. And let me actually read the verse here real quickly. I don't have the verse here. Verse 4, I believe. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, or Gibborim, which were of old men of renown. The word Nephilim is always translated giant. 3 times it's used in the Bible. It's always translated giant. When I looked up in the concordance, the name's slipping me now. Anyway, they said that it is properly a feller. And when I read that, I was like, this feels West Virginia. He's a feller. And I mentioned this to my family, and they're like, we think that means someone who fells. And I'm like, oh, and I looked it up, and that is, in fact, what it was intending. It's a feller, someone who takes down something. And then the other terms are bully or tyrant. But it is always translated giant, and it is connected to the giants. So the Nephilim are big people who are bullies or tyrants. They cut down other people. Gabor is powerful warrior tyrant. It's used 300 sometimes in the Bible, and it's translated champion, chief, giant, man, mighty man. David is actually called a Gaborim. We talked about that earlier. So is Boaz. There are a number of men. Strong man, valiant man. So these people are giants who are great men, powerful warriors. That actually is just, okay, that's interesting. And then you have that little phrase in the middle there that has to do with the sons of God and the daughters of men producing these great tyrant warriors. And we're like, what do we do with this? And if you're into conspiracy theories, have fun. There are great conspiracy theories. You can go all over the place. What exactly it means, we don't know. And I'm not going to try to push too hard. I will tell you my theory, but that's all it is. Who are the sons of God here who are coming to the daughters of men? Some suggest these are the descendants of Abel, as in the righteous, matching with the unrighteous. Some have suggested they were angels, which brings up all kinds of weird aspects of Scripture. Or I actually ran across one that said sons of God could simply mean rulers, because sometimes those who are rulers are referred to as the sons of God in Scripture. So we don't exactly know about these Nephilim, why they were giants, how they became giants, why they were tyrants. We're really not sure. My own personal theory that I've kind of mixed in a couple of things is that these were men who were demon possessed, but so that they had superpower via a supernatural being in them. But that's just my theory. I have no scriptural foundation for it other than just kind of trying to put something together with what's here. Genetically, where do giants come from genetically? And that's interesting. One source that I found, and it was actually a fairly reliable source, suggested that the DNA is created by demons and inserted into, like a section of DNA inserted. And I'm not comfortable with Satan having any creative power at all. Now, as close as I would be willing to come is that if God created mankind with the possibility of being a giant, and there could have been some kind of genetic mutation which turned that on, and whether it was not a natural mutation or a supernatural mutation, I don't know. There are things like that. Blue eyes are actually a mutation, but the coding is actually in the DNA, and there's a mutation that turns it on and off. So the geneticists tell us. So it is possible that giantism is built into the DNA, and there's simply some sort of a switch on it. The bigger question that kind of comes down to, and I've asked this question, how evil can mankind be? And that's the question: is all giants evil? And I can't find a good giant in the Bible that I'm aware of. I think that question actually came up last week, and I don't know of any. But I'm not comfortable with evil being genetic. Like, you are genetically a giant, and therefore you are evil. Now, we're all evil because we're carnal, so in that sense, we're all born evil. But I don't think it's being big, it should be connected to evil in any way. Except, and it was pointed out to me when I taught this in Sunday school, and there is some truth to the fact that if you're the biggest person on the block, carnality and bullying are going to kind of flow naturally from that. And if you've got a group of people, a family or a subculture where everybody is 3 foot, 4 foot taller than everybody around you, you could start to think that you should rule the world, and you could see how the carnality sin would flow through that. And it wouldn't be because it'd be like an effect of being big, not genetically because you're big, but as an effect of being big connected to your human nature. And so the question is, are the Nephilim unusually evil, or are they just an example of what fallen man is capable of? And I think it's important for us. Sometimes we go look at some evil action, go, there must be something wrong with that person. No normal person would do that. And sometimes I'm afraid that we underestimate the evilness of mankind. I mean, humans do some horrible things, and I'm not sure you have to be insane to do horrible things, because I'm afraid maybe it's a little bit more of our nature than what we want to admit. And the Nephilim seem to be unusually evil. God's using them as an example of pre-flood evil, but I'm not sure that means there was anything special about them other than they let the evil within them flow. Real quickly, because I'm over time, or nearing the end of my time, whichever. Did Nephilim survive the flood? And it's interesting because when the 10 spies go into Canaan, they connect the Anakim and the Nephilim as being the same. So the Anakim, which if you looked at the chart or if we went over it last week, almost all of the Old Testament giants are connected to the Anakim, but the spies connect the Anakim to the Nephilim. So if the giantism came from the Nephilim to the Anakim to all of the giants, that would mean that Noah brought giantism on the ark with him, which means somebody in his family carried the giant gene, at least. And probably, if that's correct, that would be Mrs. Ham, because many of the giants were descendants of Ham. And unless Noah was a giant, then it would be Ham's wife that would be the one carrying the gene for giantism. Now, that's making an awful lot out of a single verse. And I recognize that because it could mean that the spies could just be connecting the Nephilim to the Anakim as both being giants and not that they're genetically connected. On the other hand, if giantism is genetic, it's got to flow somewhere. So that kind of leaves it. I don't have time to get into it. I'll just mention giantism biologically is an interesting topic, and I don't have time to get into it, but there is some interesting questions about can giants work? And the basic answer would be yes, they could. But it is a little bit, once you get to a certain size, the body doesn't work as well as it does at the size it's supposed to be. Okay, next week we're going to move away from big men and move to big animals. So, thank you all for coming, giving good attention.